meta commitment. And that distinction, I think, is really, really helpful. You know, let's be completely committed, you know, to where we are. And at the same time, when we need to leave where we are, let's do it with the most grace we can muster. And that's hard. You know, it's easier to enter with grace than to leave with grace. Remember on the Sabbath, we were talking about that passage about Rabbi Akiva. He enters in peace and he leaves in peace. And it's very easy to enter in peace. It's harder to leave in peace. And that's a mystical statement. And we'll turn it over to you in a second. You know, Ram Dass once said to me, it's also true about an LSD trip. You know, it's a lot easier to enter than it is to kind of land safely. Easier to enter a marriage than to leave a marriage with grace. That's right. Entering and leaving. You know, commitments and meta-commitments, you know, is a big topic, and I think that hopefully gives us a little bit of a clarifying frame.
How long after you move to a place till you're at the same level of happiness that you were, you know, when you left? Like for me, it takes about 6 months. How about for you?
In other words, once you leave a place and you're entering a new place.
Yeah. Like you've moved physically, geographically. Like when I moved from Australia to the United States to Australia, I moved to Orlando, and then I moved to Los Angeles. So it took a few months to recover and get my groundings. About 6 months for me. I'm wondering if there's any. It
takes me much longer. Actually, that 6 months is fantastic. I actually miss, you know, one of the things we miss, you know, in terms of commitments.
I want to turn around.
Please.
Actually.
Yeah. You know, you know, I make this distinction between commitments and meta-commitments. And you talk about, which is a very elegant ability that I don't have, to be able to actually, you know, move in about 6 months, really begin to feel comfortable in a place. It takes me much longer. And I actually have a great yearning, I think many of us do, you know, to the world of, you know, just simple commitments. You just stayed. You know, of course, there's great pain in that world, you know. Right. In other words, when you just stay, you're in the wrong country, in the wrong relationship, in the wrong job. There's enormous pain in that, and I want to acknowledge that pain, and it's real. At the same time, you know, when I meet people, I'm here in Salt Lake now. So a number of my close friends in Salt Lake have been in Salt Lake or it's the area their whole lives. Yeah. And I just feel their sense of being at home here. You know, they know everybody. You know, they know the roads, and they know the terrain, and they're held in a home in a certain kind of way. And when I look back at my first marriage, had I stayed in that first marriage, which, you know, in retrospect, you know, that would have been a legitimate and genuine option, which wasn't available to me then for a lot of reasons. You know, the idea of being now 48, you know, married to the same person, you know, grandchildren, children gathered around the table, you know, is enormously, enormously compelling. You know, and yet, you know, for deep and real reason, you know, I chose a different path. And each path has its own invitation, its own grace, its own growth, and its own pain. And so I actually don't have here particular skill and elegance that it takes me a number of years. When I moved to Israel, you know, it took me 3 or 4 years, you know, till I really felt, you know, the embrace of Israel, you know, in its real deep sense. Whew, so beautiful here.
Oh, one side question. Is it true that most Israelis are wary of forming friendships with Americans making Aliyah because, I don't know what the odds are, but there's something like 80% of Americans making Aliyah go back to America. So did you notice that Israelis had a certain wariness?
That's such an interesting question, right? I actually didn't notice it, but it makes sense. I mean, I think it's part of you know, it makes sense. I didn't know that the figures were that high, that 80% of Americans who moved to Israel actually moved back. I was not aware of that. But I think what's true is that you're pointing to a larger issue, which is, in order to really open up, you know, we need to know there's a container that the person's going to stay.
Yeah.
Right? And you know, again, here's where it gets tricky, right? You know, in Catholicism, the essential commitment of marriage is to stay forever. Right? Yeah. And I understand the power of that. That's enormously powerful, enormously beautiful. In Judaism, you know, we feel that you actually can be married for a period of time, and you can actually both decide mutually that you've grown what you need to grow here, and it's not the place you can grow anymore. You'd actually part in great grace and dignity. At the same time, and here's the opposite, right? You know, the nature of love, as we'd like to believe and feel, is that love means you're going to stay even when it's hard. So how do you distinguish between love means you're going to stay even when it's hard and knowing when you need to leave? And again, we get back to what we talked about before, the wisdom of distinctions. Not to fool yourself. It's so easy to fool ourselves, right? Even the simplest man is a genius when it comes to self-deception. And so to really make that distinction in a real way is a big deal. And I think your image of Israelis, you know, being careful about, you know, becoming good friends with North American immigrants is, you know, are these people really showing up? Are they really here with us in the Israeli story? Or are they just kind of on a romantic adventure? It's almost like, you know, it's almost like the American one-night or two-year stand, but you're actually not really with us in that shared destiny, so they actually can't open up to you in the same way.
Is it true you can never become an Israeli if you move there after, I don't know, the age of 18, 21, 25?
Absolutely not. That's actually completely not true.
Do you really feel like an Israeli?
Absolutely. I mean, the old image, Levi, of the, you know, the Sabra Israeli, that old image just doesn't exist anymore. Israel is now so diverse with Ethiopians and Russians and, you know, the country's so diverse, Americans. You know, obviously, kind of, there's been a large, you know, Sephardic influx. But at this point, the image of the kind of native-born kibbutz Israeli that you can never become was true for many years. But I actually think it no longer holds true. Israel is, in one of the most wonderful ways, a great and beautiful melting pot.
Now, every group has its initiation rites. For instance, conversion to Judaism is not impossible, and it's not even, doesn't even have to be terribly difficult typically, but it's certainly not easy, particularly Orthodox Judaism. So there are conversion rites to that. What I'm thinking about, though, is how the status of Russian immigrants to Israel changed, and they suddenly started feeling accepted and that you're one of us after the horrific bombing where 21 of them got murdered in Tel Aviv in 2001 or 2002. It was so interesting that I read commentators saying that now Russian immigrants are one of us. But it took like the explosion and murder of 20 of them before they were, okay, now they are accepted, they've paid their dues as a group. What do you think about that?
I mean, it's one of the tragedies of where we are in the world today. You know, that it's sometimes easier for us to bond over shared pain than it is over freely loving the other.
Right.
You know, the initiation of the soldier who's experienced the first fire.
Right.
And the initiation of a community that's paid in blood. You know, we'd like to evolve as a people and evolve as a global community where we're actually able to receive other by actually perceiving and seeing their unique beauty, their specialness, their wonder, and not need to evolve through blood. And because paradoxically, the evolution through shared blood is actually a regression. It's actually profoundly primitive because there's nothing we actually have to do. You know, there's no great effort in showing up in a cafe and being blown up. There's great tragedy, but there's not great effort, right? To really receive someone, right, and to evolve, you know, I evolve, to evolve to a place where I can actually receive someone because I perceive their beauty, their infinite specialness, their uniqueness, their divinity, is a much higher evolution than to accept someone because their arm was blown off. And so you point to something that's very real, and we need as a people and as a collective consciousness in humanity to actually evolve beyond that to a higher level of consciousness.